All right, working on the center foot here. Um, there's three main, I guess I'll call them assemblies, to the center foot. One is the frame and the omni wheels. Now the one that I'm using is a variation that's on the Michael Baddeley in the folder somewhere in there. It's of the Vex mod for the Mark III center foot, which uses the purchased omni wheels as opposed to the ones that you 3D print yourself. And then this assembly is where the ankle goes. The ankle goes in here, and then a printed axle or a threaded rod, which I'll be using, goes through there to secure the ankle. And then the foot shell, which is also an assembly because it's the two end pieces are printed separately, and they are held on with 2 bolts on each one, and then they use square nuts like everything else in the Baddeley build. So these pieces have slots that you drop 2 square nuts into, and then they go up against this piece, and then you put the bolts through the foot shell into the covers, half moon covers, to hold them on. They're merely decorative. They're not anything that you would really need to pull these off to access, which I guess is why he did bolts on the center ankle but magnets on the outer feet. The outer feet you might need to take apart to get to the drive units and work on, whereas the center foot is not doesn't have drive units in it. It's just a passive rolling system. So the way that this assembly goes together, whether using the Vex mod or the original files, is that first this gets attached to the ankle, and the 3D printed pin that's in the files goes in to secure the ankle or threaded rod, whatever you use, which has to be flush or slightly recessed, because then the ankle attached to this drops in there. Okay, and then you can see there are 4 holes that have, again, square nuts in them. And then this frame has 4 holes that line up with the square nuts in the foot shell. And it's more difficult on this with the purchased Vex wheels because I think they're larger than the 3D printed versions, but you can see that you do just barely have access there to those 4 holes to screw this into that. So the foot shell is actually held in place by this going into this recessed rectangular hole, and then the foot shell is trapped between this piece and this piece. Now the issue I have, and hopefully I can do this with one hand, is something has not, or several things haven't quite printed to the exact right dimensions. So what I get is I get that gap. And the problem with that gap is these pieces are supposed to be holding this foot shell down. So this foot shell is clamped between this upper part that the ankle goes into and that lower part that contains the wheels. But because something happened and I've got these parts are higher than they should be, they're not clamping the foot shell at all. So it has quite a bit of movement. So if I put it together like that, driving him around, this thing's going to be doing this. So the first thing I did was try and figure out what printed wrong, and admittedly I didn't get my calipers out, and I just used a ruler and my eyeballs to measure, but this thickness seemed fine, and these two pieces are flush, so if anything in this part printed wrong, then all three of them printed too tall or too small. It would be too tall to cause that problem because they're sticking up too high when compared to this right here. Because if you look at the foot shell, this flat area here sits right here on each side, and that's what's pressing against the frame. And then these angled parts of that piece sit in these angled recesses and are pushing down on the foot shell. So that's how it attaches. So these pieces seem to be dimensionally accurate to me. Just, I mean, again, eyeball with a ruler, it's, you know, within a millimeter. So my next thought was, this plate being PETG, and everything I print tends to warp in PETG, so I figured maybe this is the problem. This one seems to be, again, within a millimeter of the height. I think it is a bit warped like this, because again, it prints right side up, and I have a problem with corners lifting off the bed. I'm a little bit better now. I think where I'm better now than when I printed these is now I've got the fan completely off for PETG. I might have it turned on a little for bridging, but I think I was at maybe 50% parts cooling fan when I was printing these before. I think that might have contributed to the warping, is that the fan was cooling the PETG and it was warping off the bed. So I'm a little bit better, but still not to the point where I would just print everything in PETG, because I still have issues. But basically this might be a little bit bowed, but it's, again, it seemed to me to be within a millimeter. It didn't seem to make up for the fact that this is too high, especially if this was dished. It'd be lower in the middle, but about where it should be on the sides. But when I put this in, it doesn't seem to rock back and forth or left to right. So it seems like this inner part is pretty flat. If I had warping, it was probably only, you know, partially on the corners. But the center section doesn't seem to be warped to the point where I can put this on and it's, you know, doing this, and it'd be like, oh, that's what happened. So I'm not sure what part is off, or if it's a combination of a little bit here and a little bit here. So I suspect it might be my foot shells. One of my earlier videos where I go over printing and assembling the outer foot shells, I had 3 parts that I know of that I printed on my TiVo Tornado that came out with the wrong dimension on one axis. The first one was one of the first pieces I printed, the skirt, R2D2 skirt in the Mark III design, cut design to fit printers with a 300 by 300 millimeter bed. There's 4 pieces to the skirt, and I printed all 4 pieces, and I was about to glue the skirt together, so I was dry fitting those 4 pieces, and they weren't fitting right, and I determined that one of the 4 pieces was wrong in one dimension. I can't remember if it was X or Y. It wasn't Z, it was X or Y. So I thought I could probably, you know, fudge it, put some extra plastic in, different ways to make it work, but in the end I decided to reprint it. So I resliced it with the same slicer, put it on the same SD card, reprinted it on the same printer, and it came out perfect. So I thought that was a weird one-off occurrence until I got to the outer foot shells. The outer foot shells are actually 3 pieces. I printed one side, the second side, and then there's a piece that goes down the other side that actually fits on a 300 by 300 millimeter bed just right if you put it at an angle crossways. So I printed the two main parts of the foot shell. I glued them both together for both the right and left foot, and then I printed those really long parts at an angle, and I held them up to the outer foot shells, and the ones that I printed at an angle were just a little bit longer than the foot shells, and it turns out that the foot shells had printed too small in, it's probably the Y direction, because I believe I printed them, I believe they print like this. So the Y dimension seemed to be just a little bit off, just like 2 to 3 millimeters. So I could have maybe fixed it by blending in with body filler on those foot shells, but it would have been noticeable. So I bit the bullet and I just reprinted the two large parts of the foot shells, and they came out fine. And again, I sliced them on the same slicer, resliced them, saved them to the same SD card, printed them on the same printer, and the second time they printed fine. So I never did figure out what that issue was. I changed to the Prusa slicer. I believe after that happened. I don't think I was using the Prusa slicer. I'd have to go look at the original video. But what I'm saying is I have had some things that I printed on the Tevo Tornado that for whatever reason printed a little bit off. And so I'm wondering if this foot shell is what printed a little bit off, although it's odd because it seems like it might be the Z height that's off, because it's sitting on there and it's not sitting right vertically. It's fine left to right and front to back. But that's kind of where I'm thinking. I mean, it's hard to get on something angled like this to get a ruler on it and measure the exact, height of this to find out if that's the problem. But without being able to figure out exactly what the problem is, and there's no way I'm going to reprint this. I mean, I wouldn't have to print the half moons, but I'd have to reprint fill, sand, paint, two different colors, and no. So I tried to think of a solution. And my main concern with the solution is the fact that the center foot is at an angle, and if I'm going to try and fix this, is that going to alter the angle of the center foot to the point where it makes something not work right? Like the angle is changed, and so now the center foot is off the ground a little, or is too far down on the ground or something like that. But I decided that if I can get it a fix that only changes things by a couple millimeters, I should be fine. I don't believe the tolerances would be so tight that if you're just a couple millimeters off that it's a huge issue. So what I did was I took this part, which is just this rectangle here, right? It's got the square nuts inside that these side panels bolt to, and the side panels have little ledges that this part sits on. And yes, it is a little bit high on that side, I realize, but it's not on that side, and there's barely any clearance. So that was another thing that I didn't think it was, that this piece was just sitting up too high, which also, if you look at it, you can see a lip here. It's actually sitting down and not level with the frame. The frame sticks up a little bit higher. So that would mean this technically should be taller, which would make my problem worse. So again, I'm not sure exactly where the problem is, but what I came up with, and just finished it tonight, is raising up the area that this foot shell sits on. So there's two ways I could have done it. Probably the easier way would be to bring some kind of a print into Mesh Mixer or the Prusa slicer and just print a few different spacers in PLA that I can glue to this rectangular area, because again, that sits right here, and that's where this gets its height. And so this foot shell needs to go a little bit higher, or this needs to go a little lower to be able to pinch the foot shell in between these pieces like it should be. So I took this rectangle into Mesh Mixer and just chopped it with the plane cut feature, and just chopped the open area and saved that as an STL. Then I brought that into the Prusa Slicer and I changed the Z height, right? So that's the thickness of it. And I made one that was 1 millimeter, 1.5, 2, 2.5, and 3 millimeters. So first I tried the 1.5 millimeter. And I don't even think I need to glue that in place. I think I can just lay it on there because it's held in place with that. It's not going to go anywhere. So 1.5 millimeters was really close but not quite right. So then I printed a 2 millimeter, and again I had a little bit of this same PETG, so I just decided to print it in PETG. It probably didn't have to be, but because it's not exactly structural, but because this is pinched in between, these are PETG, and this PETG, I just thought I'd rather just this be PETG, the same as the rest of the material here, although the foot shell itself is PLA. So I didn't need to have really the square holes, but again, I did this in Mesh Mixer, where it was just super easy to load this in, do plane cut feature, which lets you cut something on a plane, obviously, and I just I just cut the top off to make sure that I had the part that's open and not the part that has this. And yeah, so there is the 2 millimeter thick version. And then if I can do this while holding a camera with one hand. Okay, it's on there. And I'm pushing down on these because remember the bolts are going to come from up into the frame into these, so these will be pulled down. So if I push down, there really isn't any movement if I push down. Maybe a little, maybe just a tiny bit, which I'm guessing a tiny bit is probably fine. But it's nowhere near what it was without that spacer in there. So that makes these pieces pretty much level with the top of the foot shell, which is what you want. Although it is interesting that this center piece now dips down a little bit. It's a little bit recessed compared to the foot shell. Not that, you know, with the ankle there in the way, it's not something that is going to be like, oh my God, that thing is horrible. Why is it, you know, a huge gap? It's really small. You don't really see it. But I think that's the solution I'm going to stick with. And when I had this on my table in the room with the printer, I wasn't really getting any movement at all. And like I said, I'm getting a little now, but I think that's just because I'm not quite pushing on it and I'm doing this on this blanket. So I think that's going to be fine. I'm happy with that. I don't think that's going to be moving enough to really be a visible thing. I don't think you're going to see it wobbling like it obviously was without that piece in there when it moves around. And it might actually add a little bit of cushion if you bump into something. It'll have a little bit of give before it. Yeah, I'm fine with that. I'm thinking that's good. So that was my issue. That was my fix, and I do not know the cause. I'd be interested to hear anybody else who watches the video if you had a similar problem with this area. or not even problem, if you just had a similar effect on yours where the foot shell didn't feel like it was clamped tight enough, or maybe the opposite, if your foot shell seemed to be clamped really tight, and what you did to resolve that issue, or what you found as the cause, if you found a cause, because again, it's kind of hard for me to measure the full height of this thing, and I'm not going to reprint that. That's not going to happen. So this should be just absolutely fine. And if it's not, I can print a 2.5 millimeter piece if when I bolt this together it seems wobblier than I think it's going to be. But again, I'm just kind of holding with my fingers and all that stuff, so this isn't a really good test as to how tight it's actually going to be, but that seems fine to me. So there we go. Hopefully that's that issue fixed. Jason Charlton's video on modifications to the foot drives indicates he used a 5/16 inch threaded rod for the axle instead of the 3D printed part. So I plan on picking some of that up so I can do the same thing, and I believe at that point I might actually just go ahead and attach the foot to the ankle, because I'm pretty much at that stage.